Welcome to the Interval 0 video tutorial on remote debugging across a host-target connection. In this video, we will show how to configure a target 32-bit Windows machine to receive remote debug connections and set up a 32 or 64-bit host machine to communicate with the target for remote debugging of RTX applications in Visual Studio. There are two host target scenarios. In one, both the host and target systems are 32-bit Windows. In the second, the host is 64-bit Windows and the target is 32-bit. This graphic shows the setup requirements for the host and target. The host system requires 32-bit or 64-bit Windows and Visual Studio. The target system requires 32-bit Windows, the RTX runtime, and the Visual Studio Remote Debugging Monitor MSVS-Mon. The host and target must be connected via Windows Network connection. In order to debug RTSS applications, the user must be a member of the RTX Debugger's user group. Note that the RTX runtime is not yet supported on 64-bit systems. Only full versions of RTX can be used in this configuration. Evaluation versions are not supported. In Part 1, we will configure RTX Remote Debugging Support, start MSVS-Mon, and run the application we want to debug using RTSS Run. Here we have the RTX Properties dialog, which you can find under Start All Programs Interval 0 RTX. We're going to change the default debug settings, so we'll click on the Debug tab. Under Debug Support, we'll select User Level Debugging, and then Accept Remote Debug Connections via MSVS-Mon. This will enable us to communicate with the host system for remote debugging. Next, we need to start the RTX subsystem, which we can do from the Control tab. As we can see, the RTX subsystem is currently stopped. We can manually start it by clicking the Start button. Once the status bar closes, we can then verify that the RTX subsystem is now running. Next, we need to start the Visual Studio Remote Debugging Monitor MSVS-Mon. To do this, we need to copy the files for the remote debugger from the host system, which we see here, to the target system. We can find these files on the host system in the Visual Studio install directory at the location common7/IDE/remote-debugger/x86. The entire x86 folder must be copied to the target system. Once the x86 folder is on the target system, we open the folder and double-click the file msvsmon.exe to start MSVS-Mon. If Windows Firewall is enabled on the target system, the Configure Firewall for Remote Debugging prompt appears. In this dialog, we will choose to unblock remote debugging from any computer. There are a few options we need to set in the Visual Studio Remote Debugging Monitor window. We'll click Tools Options to display the Options dialog. Here we'll copy the server name, which we'll need to attach to the remote process in Visual Studio. Under Authentication mode, we'll select No Authentication, as well as the option to allow any user to debug. We'll also increase the maximum idle time, which you can do to allow more time to connect with the open socket for remote debugging. Note that if no connection is made during this time, MSVS-Mon will exit. The next setup step on the target system is to start the RTSS application we want to debug remotely. To do this, we'll open a command prompt and type the following: RTSS run, which will use the RTX RTSS run utility to run the application, followed by the /y flag, which is required so Visual Studio can attach to the application, followed by the path to the application, which for this example is test.rtss. Now that we have specified support for remote debugging on RTX, configured MSVS-Mon, and have our RTSS application running, we can move on to host setup, which requires starting the Visual Studio session and attaching to the running RTSS process. Here we have our solution open in Microsoft Visual Studio on the host system. and we need to attach to the RTSS process we started during target setup. To do this, we'll click the Attach to Process option in the Debug menu. This displays the Attach to Process dialog. In this dialog, we need to make a few changes. First, we'll set the transport option to remote. And then we'll set the qualifier option to the server name that we copied from the MSVSmon options dialog during target setup. We also need to make sure that the Show Processes from All Users setting is checked. Once we've done this, we can look for our running RTSS process, test.rtss, under Available Processes. And when we find it, we can select it and then click the Attach button. We're now attached to our RTSS process running on the target system, and we can debug the application using the standard Visual Studio debugging features that we are familiar with. For instance, we can add a breakpoint and break into the code. We've reached the end of this video tutorial on remote debugging in RTX. For more information, see the PDF mini tutorial, Remote Debugging with a 64-bit Windows Host and 32-bit target, and the RTX product documentation available online and with the RTX product. You can visit Interval Zero online at www.intervalzero.com. Thanks for watching.